Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our July meeting. I was pleased I said good afternoon because I'm so used to saying good morning, but welcome along again. I still can't see you, but hopefully you can see and hear me. I know we have, on a couple of recent occasions, had some early sound problems, which then sort themselves out. So our intrepid technology expert, Ryan, has told me to wear my earrings today, so I'm sure I look very nice. Just a couple of things to say before we hand over to our speaker today. As we probably all know, the impact of coronavirus is going to sit with us for some time yet. More and more things are opening up, but some of us are still relatively cautious about what we go and do. So as Beckles U3A, we are trying to offer things to our members as we think they might still spend more time at home than they might wish to. So the two things that we are particularly doing at the moment, and some of you will have heard before, that we are encouraging groups to meet by offering a grant to find new ways of doing so. So if you're in a group and you want to get together in some way or other, either just to socialise or to continue learning, then do get in touch with us because we might be able to help you do that if you have some difficulties. The second aspect of what we're doing is to continue with our monthly meetings with a range of engaging speakers, and we've also added an evening meeting into the mix, and some of you may indeed have listened and watched our talk at the end of June about Beckles Lido. Well, we're doing that again on July the 30th, not to talk about Beckles Lido, but with Sue Sherman talking about Japan and Korea. So we're venturing a bit further afield this time, and details will come out next week about that. So on to today, and I am very excited to continue our theme of local talks with Ben Witchell from Flint Vineyards in Earsham. Wine consumption has increased during lockdown, and not all of it's down to me. Some of you must have played a part as well, but I'm sure you're all interested in how Ben and Hannah have established a successful business in our neck of the woods. Now, as I've said before, when a speaker is live in front of an audience, we show our appreciation by 1, 2, or 3 rounds of applause at the end. That's a bit difficult to do with this, so I would again repeat our request that if you want to show your appreciation of Ben's talk, then please send us emails in whatever way you wish to. There's loads of addresses you can use, and we will pass them on to Ben so he gets his applause in a different way. So I hope you will do that. Okay, without any more delay, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Ben Witchell.
Okay, hi everybody. I believe I'm sharing my screen with you, so I'll just get the PowerPoint presentation up and running, and hopefully you can all see that. So thanks Graham for the introduction. This is going to be interesting, talking to a blank screen for 45 minutes, but I'll try my best to imagine your applause and laughter in the background, as I'm sure you're all doing. As Graham said, my name's Ben, and I run Flint Vineyard, and we're a sort of small to medium-sized vineyard in the Waveney Valley near to Bungay. So you can see a picture hopefully on your screens, which shows that's my wife Hannah there, and that is overlooking the Waveney Valley going towards Bungay and Earsham, the villages of Earsham in the background. So we're actually technically in Earsham, which is just near to Bungay. So we're on the Suffolk-Norfolk border, technically in Norfolk, although we have a sort of Suffolk postcode. And we're Flint Vineyard, and we've been here since 2016. And we planted in 2016. We also installed a winery in 2016, and we have been doing a bit of planting every year. up until 2018, which was our last planting, and we've now got about 26,000 vines in the ground, covering about 6 hectares. And we've been producing wine since 2016, which was our first vintage. So that's just where we are. Things have been going very well in the first few years. We've been lucky enough to receive a lot of nice reviews from wine journalists and wine critics, such as Oz Clarke and Ollie Smith and Jancis Robinson and various others, and also to receive lots of nice awards. We've been going in for awards since we started. So things have been going well, and we're now producing about sort of 30 to 35,000 bottles of wine a year, and distributing that throughout Norfolk and Suffolk and further afield, primarily through Berry Brothers and Rudd, who are quite an important wine merchant in London, and they take our national distribution, and they've had us into some lovely places like Fortnum and Mason and the Hawksmoor chain of restaurants, for example. So our wines can be found in a variety of nice places in Norfolk and Suffolk, but also a bit further afield. So that's basically who we are. So yeah, I'm just going to take you through a few pictures, hopefully, just so you can visualize what we're doing. And really the idea of today is to just give you an introduction to what we're doing. So I'll give you a bit of introduction about my background, how I got into winemaking, and then take you through how we plant a vineyard, a bit of a history about English vine growing, and then some information about what we do in the winery. So if you've got any questions, I know this is probably quite a tricky thing to do. I can't hear you guys right now, but you're able to give me questions in the public chat forum, and I can pick those up and do my best to answer those as we go through. So I'm very happy for you to ask questions throughout the course of this, or if you'd rather ask at the end, there will also be some time to do that then. So yeah, so that's the team. That's my gang. So I'm in the middle, Hannah with the blonde hair, and then there's Juliet, and then there's 3 lads who help me in the vineyard. And then we're standing in the vines in the prime of the summer. And there's another slide with me, looking a bit lanky and gangly in the hills of Beaujolais. So I got into winemaking quite a long time ago now. I've been interested in wine for many years. I'm in my 40s now. I got into wine, as most people do, in their 20s, and got more and more interested in vines and wine. And Hannah and I did a bit of traveling in 2007 when we took a break from our careers. I used to work in IT, and we ended up traveling around the Southern Hemisphere. And sort of semi-coincidentally, we ended up going to a lot of the winemaking regions. So we started off in Argentina, then went to Chile, and then we went to New Zealand, Australia, and then ended up in South Africa. And we spent 9 months traveling. We worked for an Argentinian vineyard during that time. And when we returned back to England in 2008, that gave me a good chance to really think about what I wanted to do as a career. It gave me a lot of time to think, and I decided that I'd like to take a break from IT and try something different. And that's when I decided to get involved in wine. So I wrote an email to all of the English vineyards asking how one goes about becoming a winemaker. Some of them offered me some work for free to turn me into a winemaker. Others pointed me in the direction of an agricultural college in the south of England called Plumpton College. Plumpton College is just north of Brighton in East Sussex, and that's really where the hub of the English wine industry has grown up. There's a lot of sparkling wine, particularly using the sort of champagne method down in East Sussex, and they've got very similar soils to the soils found in Champagne. Also being the lowest area from a latitude point of view in England, technically, you know, some of the warmest weather down there, that seemed a natural place for starting. And so as a result, that's really where the hub of the English wine industry has grown up. So I was put in touch with this place called Plumpton College, which I said is an agricultural college just north of Brighton. And they've started doing a wine course there, which has now been running for about 20 years and has become the only place in the Northern Hemisphere where you can study winemaking at degree level in the English language, unless you head over to California. So I was really lucky to go to Plumpton, and I started doing my Plumpton course in, oh crikey, when was that? That was 2009. I spent 3 years at Plumpton studying for a Bachelor of Science in viticulture and enology. So viticulture being the growing of grapes, enology being the science of winemaking. During Plumpton, I spent a lot of time working for English wineries in and around Sussex. And I then also did some work placements in California, in the Napa Valley, in Greece. And then finally, when I graduated, I took my first position as assistant winemaker in the Beaujolais region of France, which is what this photo is showing. That's showing me bending down, pruning some bush vines, these little gobelet vines. It felt like a bit of a joke, really. I'm 6'4", and all of their vines are trained about a few centimeters off the ground. So I was the only tall Englishman looking a bit silly pruning vines. But that was how I sort of learnt the ropes. I did a bit of a 3-year course and then went to spend 2 years in France. So hopefully the next slide will show the chateau. That's where I was working, Chateau Grange Cochard. And we lived in a small apartment. That wasn't my chateau, just in case any of you are getting the wrong impression. I was working for a more wealthy couple than me, and we were just living in their garage. And that was where the winery also was, and we were making some wine. So Hannah and I spent 2 years there, and a great experience. We were working in the winery. You can see us there with the team. And then we had our first daughter, Rosie, who is on the right. Hannah's holding Rosie. And that was a bit of a catalyst for thinking about, right, let's make a move back to England and settle in England. So we decided to move back to England in 2014. But before we did that, we had to think about how we were going to continue with our winemaking plans. And I didn't really know how I was going to go about it. I was either going to sort of try and work for a large winery in England or try and do something myself. And so what we did, we sent a chance email to a farmer. Oh, that's not the slide I want. I thought it was a different slide. So we sent, sorry about that. We sent a chance email to a farmer who's a guy called Adrian Hitwell. And he lives not far from us, over here in Norfolk. He lives in the neighbouring village of Denton. And he was a friend of Hannah's mum and dad's. And we were quite keen to move to this part of the world, which I'll explain in a minute, in this part of the country to make wine. I'll come to that in a second. But we sent an email to Adrian Hitwell, knowing that he was a farmer here, that he might be able to key us in to potentially finding someone with some land. And I sent him an email that said, you know, anyone that's selling a small plot of land that might be suitable for some grapes. And I gave him a rough spec, which needs to be on some south-facing, free-draining soil, ideally with a slope. And he came back to me and said, I don't know anyone selling anything like that, but I'm the farmer of some land which matches your description. And so anyway, we came to visit Earsham in 2014. We met Adrian. We saw the potential of the site, and I've got some photos of that coming up to show you. And we also saw the potential of a lot of the buildings that are based here, because he's the previous arable farmer here, but he retired from farming about 10 years ago. So his farm buildings have essentially been disused, and he was very keen to repurpose them. But they're a little bit too small for some of the equipment required for arable farming. And so they're only really suitable for something like a vineyard. So there was basically a very good site here for planting. There were lots of buildings that were suitable for a winery, and we couldn't turn down the opportunity to form a partnership with Adrian and come and establish Flint Vineyard. So we moved here in 2015. So we visited here in 2014 to meet Adrian. We moved here in 2015, and then we planted our first vines and made our first wine in 2016. So that's the sort of short story of how we got here. But why did we want to come to Norfolk is the big question. What is it about East Anglia and even the UK that enables us to grow grapes? Because everybody thinks about growing grapes in hot countries. But when I was at Plumpton College and I was doing all my studying, I got quite interested in climate with regard to growing grapes. And I had a lot of information that was given to students from the Met Office, that very detailed information, daily data sets for every 5 kilometre square grid on the map of England, for every different type of temperature, every type of climate variable going back to the 60s. And I took this information and I extrapolated it and put it into overlaid it on a map of England. As you can see, this is a map that I produced, and it was just really with a view to getting an idea of where the key good areas regarding climate sit in England. And so when you look at a map of England, you can see that there's a warm band that really runs down from East Anglia to the bottom southwest in Cornwall. And you would expect that it would just be the more southerly regions of England. The further south you go in terms of latitude, surely the warmer it gets. But you can actually see that in the east of England, we've actually got quite good conditions. And so the red areas show what I deem to be the most suitable areas. So that would be lots of sunshine hours, good mean temperatures, and low rainfall and low instances of frost. And so we actually have very similar mean temperatures to some of the more southerly regions, but it's really the rainfall that's quite interesting in this part of the world. We have about a third of the rainfall that you see further southwest in places like West Sussex and Cornwall, particularly around the time of the harvest. And the English grape harvest occurs around about September, October, and we can have about a third of the rainfall that's seen elsewhere. And that's particularly useful for grape growing, because one of the things that can blight vines and fruit and the grapes is the instance of powdery and downy mildew, so fungal diseases which can get onto the fruit. And those sorts of things are exacerbated by damp and humid conditions. So by having less rain at the harvest, it means that we can worry less about the sorts of problems that are exacerbated through rainfall and damp conditions. And that means that we can hang the grapes on the vine a little bit longer, and we can get them to high ripeness levels. And so we're tending to find, as a rough trend in England, that there's more grapes being grown in East Anglia and southeast of England that are more suitable for still wines, because with still wines you need slightly higher levels of ripeness, because you need more sugar and more flavor ripeness to make a still wine than you do for something like sparkling. So broadly speaking, some of the sparkling wines tend to be made in the south and the southwest, or maybe further inland in Surrey, or Hampshire, where they don't necessarily have the conditions to grow still grape varieties. And the very ripe grapes coming out of England tend to be coming from the southeast and East Anglia. So that can be anywhere from sort of South Norfolk down through to Essex and Kent. So for that reason, we were very keen to come to Norfolk. And through chance, we knew a farmer here called Adrian, sent him an email, and the rest is history. So there you go. That's Adrian. That's me and Hannah, and that is on the day of planting. So that's looking back up the hill, and that's the little farmhouse that we're renting from Adrian that we live in. So the site that we've got and that we visited and made the decision to plant when we came to see Adrian is a southeast facing site. So we're actually looking back up the hill. We're sort of looking northish, but if you were to stand at the top of that hill and look back down, you'd be looking down southeast. And that's a really good aspect for an English vineyard, because the sun rises in the east. It stays on the site for the morning and warms up the site nice and early in the morning, but we're quite an open site. And so we retain the sun on the site, the westerly sort of setting sun, for most of the day. And so the southeastern aspect is probably one of the more favourable aspects for an English vineyard. We've also got a slope, which is quite unusual for Norfolk, but the slope is particularly useful for a frost mitigation situation. Frost is a big problem in England, particularly in spring. In the winter, vines are very tolerant to frost. They are dormant at that stage, and they can take down to about -15 degrees Celsius. But in the springtime, which is just the beginning of their growing season, around about mid-April, any new buds or shoots that develop on the vine at that point are very susceptible to anything below 0 degrees, even a number of hours. And so the sorts of frosts that normally cause problems are what we call radiation frosts, and that's when you get a cold, still night in spring when there's no air movement, no wind. The cold air is heavier than the warm air, and it sinks, and it displaces the warm air, and then cold air will behave like water. It will roll down a slope, and then it'll eventually get to the bottom of the slope, or a bank of trees or something like that, where it can't roll any further, but the cold air will continue to roll in behind it and pool up, and then the level of that cold air will fill up just like a bath. And so what happens is that as the cold air is pooling into the vineyard, if it gets to the height of where the buds are on the vines, which is about 1 meter off the ground, that's when you can have a frost event. So by planting on a slope, you are giving the cold air a chance to roll out of the vineyard and go somewhere else, and it does provide some sort of mitigation. So by having a slope, you're hoping that helps against frost protection. That's just looking back up the slope. again, before we planted, that's even before we'd ploughed, on a lovely overcast Norfolk day. And that's looking back down the slope from the top end of the field, looking more or less sort of southeast after we'd planted, and that's the full expanse of the first vineyard that we planted. So I said earlier that we've got about 26,000 vines in the ground. In 2016, we planted the first vineyard, which is 12,500 vines. There's 12,500 vines there, and that's the first vineyard that we planted. Another nice thing about this site, which you can actually see on this photo, if you look at some of the soil, you can see lots of flints come to the surface. The area where we are in the Waveney Valley, this is an old glacial area, and a glacial movement has left some very interesting deposits of gravel and sand and flint, hence why we're called Flint Vineyard. Over the road from us, so behind the trees at the back of that photo, there's Earsham gravel, and they've been extracting and digging for a long time now, which demonstrates that we've got some quite interesting deep, sandy, dry soils. And sandy, dry, flinty, stony soils are very good for grape growing, because those sorts of soils tend to be poorer soils compared to things like clay, which are much more fertile. Something like sand will drain away nutrients and water much quicker than clay. And vines are very, very vigorous plants. Vines will grow. There you go. There's the vineyard after well, actually last year. So you can see the vines there are growing incredibly strong. They're all green, and when vines grow, they grow very, very vigorously. So to plant in poorer, sandy soils, it stops the vines from getting too vigorous, too fertile, because if a vine is planted in very strong soil and it's given the chance just to grow as strongly as it wants, it will produce so much foliage and vegetation and green leaves that it actually starts to shade its neighboring plants. And when it gets into the shade, a vine then will produce a hormone which is there to encourage it to grow out of the shade. Obviously, by doing that, it's creating more shade and in turn shading itself again. So it gets into an ever-decreasing cycle, which is called the vegetative cycle, where because it's in a shady environment, it starts to just reproduce asexually and just produce lots of leaves and lots of foliage. We want it to focus on the sexual method of reproduction, which is producing fruit. And in order to do that, we have to stress it a little bit. Not too much, but we have to give it a certain amount of stress. And one of the ways that we do that is to plant it in slightly poorer soils that don't give it all of the fast food nutrients that something like clay might do, so that the vine has to work a bit hard, and then it will concentrate on producing fruit. And hopefully be a bit more balanced with that respect. So that's another thing that we were very pleased with the site, was the nice sort of sandy, free draining soils that we've got here. But just to briefly go through the varieties that we've got, so we're planting a number of different grape varieties. At the top of the field, we've got some Pinot Noir, and Pinot Noir is one of the classic Burgundian grape varieties where it produces lovely complex red wines. It's also used, although it's a red grape, it can be used for white wines, particularly in Champagne, where it gets made into white sparkling wines. We've also planted some Pinot Blanc, which is the sister variety to Pinot Noir, and that's a lovely complex grape variety that's now growing really well in England, and we're going to be producing a barrel fermented, quite complex and textured still white wine from that. And then at the bottom of the slope, the vines that are closest to the bottom, that is a grape variety called Bacchus. And Bacchus is a German grape variety, and it was crossed in the early 20th century, so it's actually a specific cross of other parent varieties, and one of those parent varieties is Riesling, but it was crossed in Germany with a view to being grown in some of the cooler regions of Germany. And so when the English first started planting vines, which was around about the 1970s, people started just to try and plant some vines. Before that, not much had happened since the Roman times. There were Roman vineyards, but up until the sort of 60s and 70s, 80s, people hadn't really planted any vines. So when we first started experimenting, the pioneers of English vine growing did that. They looked across to Germany, because Germany is a similar latitude, similar climate, and we thought, what works there might have a chance of working here. And Bacchus was one of those varieties that likes some of the cooler regions of Germany, and so that was one of the first varieties to be planted in England. Now, of all the German varieties that were originally planted in England, Bacchus is the one that's really stood the test of time. And it produces a lovely, crisp, aromatic wine. Some people compare it to Sauvignon Blanc, but because one of its parent varieties is Riesling, it also has some characters of Riesling. It grows particularly when in England. It likes It likes our climate. It doesn't want something too warm. It's now a bit too warm in Germany for Bacchus, and in Germany, Bacchus tends to produce quite uninteresting wines that don't have really a nice acidity, whereas in England, we retain that sort of crisp acidity, and we get a lot more aroma and flavour development. So it also particularly likes Norfolk because it likes the dry conditions we've got here, because it's by nature a very vigorous variety. So it likes the dry conditions that we've got here, both regard to the soils that we've got, particularly at Flint, but also the dry climate that Norfolk has. So they're the three great varieties we've got: Pinot Noir, Pinot Blanc, and Bacchus. Pinot Noir, we will be predominantly making a still red, but we will also use it for a still white in some years. Pinot Blanc will go into a still white wine, and the Bacchus will also go into a still white wine. So we're mainly focusing on still wines here, which I think is more suited to Norfolk, but also it's a bit different to what most people are doing in England, who most of the vineyards in England tend to be focusing on sparkling wines. We are making a sparkling wine as well, but it's not a traditional method sparkling wine, much like the others in England. We were the first English vineyard to experiment with making a sparkling wine using the Charmat method of production. And the Charmat method of production is what's used in Prosecco. And the difference between the Prosecco method and the Champagne method, just in short, because I appreciate probably haven't got too much time today to go into all the details, is that in Champagne, the secondary fermentation, which is what creates the fizz, happens inside a bottle. In Prosecco, that happens inside a tank. And in the Prosecco method, you end up with a much more fruit-driven, sort of approachable style of wine that can be bottled and drunk earlier, whereas Champagne tends to be towards a more sort of complex, bready, sort of yeasty flavours. So we were the first vineyard to experiment with that, and we also make a sparkling wine, but predominantly we're focused on stills. Right, oh, there's another nice photo of me and Hannah, and that's our two girls. So since leaving France, we've now got another daughter, Ella. That's Rosie and Ella in the vines. And this is our team working hard manually on the vines, and this is just to try and give you a view of some of the manual processes that we go through in the vineyard. The vines actually were all planted by machine. There's the starting point. A German contract team came along with a GPS guided tractor, and they can plant 12 to 15,000 vines a day. And that is really the first job, which is a mechanical process. But thereafter, a lot of the work in the vineyard is done by hand. So what you can see the team doing here, they are actually going through the vine, and they are tucking the long shoots into the trellis wires. Basically the vines are all supported by trellis system, which is a series of metal posts with various different wires strung along it, and they're by hand tucking those in. And actually, I think that's Steve there, he's putting a little clip in place just to make sure that all the vines are nice and upright, just so that we can maximize the canopy space, just to encourage photosynthesis. That's me doing another similar job, and you can see that on the floor there's a few shoots, and what we do go through is we go and strip off some of the leaves and some of the shoots, just so that we can keep the canopy free from too much shade, and also it minimizes any kind of fungal disease. So there's a lot of manual work in the vineyard. It starts with the pruning, and the pruning happens over the winter, and the pruning is all done by hand. And we've got 26,000 vines. You can prune perhaps 1,000 vines in a day. But once you've pruned the vine, there's a lot of wood that you have to pull out, because all of these green shoots that you can see here, these over the winter will turn woody, and that's when we start to prune. And we use a system called cane replacement pruning. And the cane replacement pruning is when you prune off all of the old wood from the previous year, with the exception of one of the previous year's shoots, which is then lignified and turned to wood. And then you tie that shoot down onto the first lowest wire on the trellis system, called the fruiting wire. And from that 1-year-old wood, that has got buds on it which have been preformed the previous year, that's when you get your new shoots growing. So that 1-year-old shoot, which is then called a cane, once it's gone dormant, is laid down horizontally on the fruiting wire of the trellis system, and then the shoots grow from that, and they're positioned vertically. So every year we've got to pull out all of the old wood, with the exception of one cane. So you're talking about 90% of what is on that vine will be pruned away and taken off, and that's a big job in itself. And we have to then burn that, and we burn it just to reduce any instances of fungal disease being left in the vineyard over the winter. Right, so I think that's probably done enough in the vineyard. At this point, I would say to my tour any questions, and they might say, well, how does that work? But I have not had any questions, and so I will move on and talk about the winemaking. So this is our winery, and this is one of Adrian's old grain stores. So this would have been part of the arable farm before, and it's a great sized barn for turning into a winery. We had to do very minimal conversion. We put a special self-draining floor that was coated so it's easy to keep clean. We've installed all of the tanks and other equipment to the highest spec that we could possibly do. You can see a lot of stainless steel tanks there, and you can see some purple pipework going onto the backs of the tanks, and you can see these little dimpled bits on the sides and the backs of the tanks, and they're cooling jackets, and the purple pipes allowing us to pipe a refrigerant through the backs of the tanks, which means that we can heat or cool the liquid inside the tanks, so we can control the temperature of the fermentations, which is very important because it affects the flavors and the styles that you get in the resulting wine. You can see the press in the middle of the winery, and then at the back of the winery, in that little white box room, we've got a laboratory where there's lots and lots of analytical equipment, and we can keep on top of the winemaking process and chemically analyze all the different components of the wine from grape through to bottle. So we've got a lot of very modern equipment in the winery. But you can also see there's a couple of barrels dotted about the place, but we've got a lot more barrels than that. I tend to buy about 30 barrels a year. And for me, barrels represent a different side to winemaking. So on one side, you've got the very modern tanks and the laboratory and the analytical side that I learned when I was at college, which is quite scientific. But then you've got the side of the more traditional side of winemaking, which is reflected in our use of barrels. And we have a Venn diagram for our logo, which is on my t-shirt. I don't know if you can see that very well, but it'll be on the logo at the end of the presentation. And our logo is two interlocking circles. One of those circles represents the science of winemaking, the other the tradition of winemaking. And as I said, the tradition of winemaking is represented by the barrels, and also by the fact that I spent 2 years working in Beaujolais. And it really reflects my philosophy. You have to have an understanding that underpins what you're doing sort of scientifically and knowledge-wise, but you also have to respect the tradition and the instincts that are required in order to make wine, and that's reflected in our barrels. So we're very lucky with the barrels. We actually buy about 30 barrels a year, and we buy them from a Burgundian wine estate, the winemaker of which I got to know quite well when I was working in Beaujolais. So Burgundy is over the border from Beaujolais, and this particular wine estate where we get our barrels from is based in the village of Puy-Fuissé, or actually there's a village called Puy and a village called Fuissé, but the wine region is called Puy-Fuissé. And there they're making very oaky Chardonnay wines. And what tends to happen with barrels and winemaking is that the wine producers that are making very oaky styles of wine will buy brand new barrels direct from the cooperage. And when oak barrels are brand new, the staves of the wooden staves have just been seasoned and toasted. And so when you put wine inside that barrel, it imparts a lot of very oaky flavor to the wine. Now, as the barrels are used over time, they develop sediment which coats the inside of the barrel, and that blocks the direct contact between the wood and the wine, and so you get less of a pickup of the direct oak flavor. So they become a bit more delicate with regard to how much oak flavor they impart to the wine. So what happens is that people making very oaky wines, they want the brand new barrels which give lots of oak strength, and they might use them for 3 years and sell them to a wine producer producing lighter styles of wine. So normally the Burgundian producers would buy brand new barrels, sell them after 3 years to the guys in Beaujolais, and we now intercept some of those barrels, and we're lucky to know the provenance of the barrels that we get in excellent condition. We buy them when they're 3 years old from a Burgundian producer, and then we use them for another 3 years, and then we'll then sell them on to a brewery or a distillery, even when they're not giving us enough oak flavor. But because they're a bit lighter in character, they work really nicely with the delicate, more aromatic styles of wine that we're making here in England. So that's really a bit about my philosophy of winemaking. And so just briefly to go through the winemaking process. The winemaking starts around about sort of September in England. And so the grape growing season starts in April, when I was talking about the frost. All the ripening happens, and then finally the grapes are picked around about sort of September, October. So we'll be picking the grapes, and we pick them into all by hand. Everything is picked by hand. So it's a team of about 10 or 20 people going through the vines, picking off the bunches at the stalks as whole intact bunches of grapes, and then dropping them gently into a smaller crate like the ones that you can see stacked up in the picture there. Those crates will be put on a pallet and brought up to the winery, and then we will process those grapes within hours of picking them. And so they've all been picked, brought up to the winery. The first thing we do is we will sort them. So I'm going to try and find a picture. There are some grapes there. First thing we will do before we do anything with them is sort them. So sorry for flicking about a little bit here, but you can just see on the right hand side of that slide there, if it's catching up. I can't tell if it's catching up with you or not, but the slide there has got a sorting table on the right hand side, just a stainless steel table. And so we put the grapes on that sorting table, they shake from one end down to the other, and we can visually sort them. And we have about 6 people sorting the grapes. And we're looking for a number of different things. We're looking for the ripeness levels. So if they're underripe, we can remove any of the grapes that we don't want. We're looking for things like mildew or botrytis, bunch rot, and we have a 0% tolerance on those. But if the grapes are in good condition and clean, like the ones that you can see I'm holding there, then there's really very little we need to sort. But we have the ability to sort visually through the grapes to make sure that when we start working with the grapes, they're in the absolute best condition that we can get them in. So you can see we've got a lot of helpers in the winery at the harvest time. And at this point, it's very busy and very noisy because we've got some machinery working, such as the sorting table and other things happening, and people walking about with the grapes. And the first thing that we do is we manually load them into our press. So you can see what I'm doing here is just tipping a crate of grapes into that press. Excuse me, that's poor slide management. Into this press here, and our press is basically a horizontal drum, and it can take about 2 tons of grapes, and there's a little sliding hatch door in the drum, so that press is sort of looking away from us. If you can imagine a drum sort of facing towards the back wall of the winery, and that drum can spin and rotate, so at the time of loading it, we orient it with the door facing upwards, and as you can see, we're tipping the grapes into the door. Then we slide that hatch shut, and that's when we can start the pressing process. So the pressing process is just the inflation of a membrane inside that press, which is back against the walls of the press, which can start to be inflated by pushing compressed air behind it. And the inflation of that membrane, or you can imagine like a balloon inside that press, just starts to squeeze onto the grapes, and it presses them together, and that's when the juice starts to flow. So the juice will flow out of the press, and the first sort of 40 or 50% of the juice that comes out of the press is classified as the free run, or in Champagne they would call that the cuvee, and that is generally loosely regarded as the sort of more higher grade premium juice that comes out. We then continue to press, and we can increase the pressure that we're applying, and then we collect what is called the pressings, or in Champagne they would call that the tie, and that's the later pressings. It's had a little bit more pressure applied, and we put that into a different tank. So initially, the first sort of few bits, we'd take the free run, pump that into a tank, keep squeezing, and then pump the remaining juice that comes out of the press at the latter stage of the press cycle into another tank. And we do that really from a quality control reason. We're very focused on quality here. We're aiming not just to make good English wine, but we want to make wine that we're proud of on a world stage. And one of the things that they do in Champagne, which is why I mentioned them with regard to this process of separating the different types of juice that come out of the press, is that it's very important in Champagne that the highest quality champagnes are made from a much higher proportion of the free run, or the cuvee juice, which is the first juice that's come out of the press. And so they segment their juices into different batches and put only the best juice into the best of the champagnes. And we can do a similar thing like that as well. We can direct the best bits of the juice into our more premium wines, and it just gives us much more control over quality when it comes to the blending process at the end. So yeah, that's something that we do with regard to quality. Quality being, one of our key focuses here. So the press will run for about 4 hours, and at the stage when the press is running, the winery gets very quiet because the press is completely autonomous. It's computer controlled, and I've programmed it, and it takes about 4 hours just to very gradually build up the pressure, very gently, so we can do long, slow, gentle press cycles. And from about 2 tons of grapes, because we'll our press will take 2 tons at a time, we'll yield about 1,600 litres of juice. And that juice, as I said, is pumped into different tanks, depending on whether it's free run or pressings, and then it's time to begin the fermentation. So the fermentation process is just the conversion of the natural sugars in the grape juice into alcohol. No sugar needs to be added. No other flavors need to be added. Someone on the floor today asked me, why does your wine taste like apricots? Surely you're soaking it with apricots. And it's like, no, there's nothing else in there. That's just the magic of grapes. Grapes contain different aromatic compounds in the skins which transform through fermentation. So the fermentation process is the conversion of sugars to alcohol, and it's yeast that do the job, and it's the same sorts of yeast that you would find in bread making. And there are yeasts that we can either buy and add, and there are all sorts of different yeasts that you can use, which will create different flavors. Or we can just rely on indigenous yeasts that live within the winery that will sort of spontaneously start a fermentation, depending on what we want to do. So once we've got the juice out of the press, and this is describing, obviously making our Bacchus wine or a white wine, we will take that white juice and we will warm the press up to about the tank up to about 12 degrees. And that will be a good temperature for the yeast to start doing their work. And then the yeast will start acting on the sugars, and they'll convert all the sugar into alcohol. And that process of fermentation can take anything from a number of weeks to a number of months. And the fermentation is considered complete when all of the sugar has been converted into alcohol, and then the wine is technically complete and it's dry. And at that stage, that could be around about the end of October. So we might be picking Bacchus at the beginning of October, and we might have some completed wines in the winery by the end of October. But the wine is a long way from being ready to be drunk. Because the fermentation is just finished, the yeast start to die as they run out of their food source, which is sugar, and they then start very slowly to sink to the bottom of the tank. And that process of the yeast sinking is what clarifies the wine, because as they form a sediment on the bottom of the tank, just sinking by gravity, they leave behind them pure, polished white wine. But that process of clarification, the yeast forming a sediment, can take up to 2 months, 3 months maybe. And Hannah and I will then come back to the vineyard, up to the winery in February time. And at that stage, the wines will be coming clear, and we can draw a sample from the tanks, and it will be pure, polished, looking like a proper white wine. And that's when the first time we can actually tell what the characters or the personalities of the wines are actually going to be like. And at that stage, we can start thinking about how we blend the different wines together. So Hannah and I will take different samples from the different tanks. We'll go down into our kitchen, and then we'll pour different samples of those wines, start to understand how the wines taste, and then we can think about blending them together. So, for example, the Bacchus that we make is actually a blend of 8 separate Bacchus wines that we've all made, but just in different styles. So we actually had 8 separate fermentations of Bacchus, all taken from different vineyard sites and treated separately. The idea being that Bacchus is a very expressive grape variety, and you can create different expressions of Bacchus based on how you handle it in the winery. And then Hannah and I do the blending in the kitchen. We're making up different samples using a measuring cylinder of different wines that go in, and once we go through a number of different iterations, and once we've decided on the blend, I come up to the winery and I make the blend on a much larger scale in thousands of litres rather than in 100 millilitres, which is what we're doing in the kitchen with our measuring cylinder. And so once I've made the blend, the wine is then almost ready for bottling. And our bottling process takes place at the winery. We don't have our own bottling facilities, but we actually use a mobile contract bottling line. So we're very lucky that there's a mobile bottling service that travels across England. And this is what happens all through France, but we've only got one in England, and he's got the most state-of-the-art bottling equipment. And so he can bottle our wine in the most clean and efficient way without any introduction of oxygen or bacteria at that stage. And so it means that I've spent so much time and effort making the wine as well as I can. I don't have any worries about when it's put into a bottle. So we normally bottle around about April or May, and the bottling team that come along can do about 10,000 bottles a day. And you can see there, we've got the final product just coming off the bottling line. And we'll normally release our wines about a month after bottling. So from grape through to bottle, it takes from roughly sort of September to the following May to get that into the bottle. So that's really it in terms of the winemaking process and sort of the overview of what we're doing in the vineyard. You can just see on this slide here some of our labels, and again we use the Venn diagram motif, which is just two overlapping circles, and when we use them on the bottles, we try and use different color combinations just to reflect the different flavor profiles in the wine. So you can see the Bacchus there, and I was saying Bacchus is that Riesling Sauvignon style wine, and it often displays characters of tropical fruits, being the pink, and lime being the green. The one on the right is our red Pinot Noir Precoce, which is a sort of a Beaujolais Cru style wine. And we have made a rosé in the past, but now we're making another dry white wine, which we call Silex Blanc, Silex just being the French word for flint. And that's a more Pinot dominant, sort of complex, textured, barrel-aged white wine that's very different to the Bacchus. So that's just an idea of some of our labels. And hopefully that's a nice overview of what we're doing. And I think I'm probably going to almost wrap up now. So I'll just finally just say that we are offering tours here. That's Hannah serving one of our lunches. We do what we call a 15-mile lunch, and people can come on a tour either on a Wednesday or a Saturday, and then they can stay for lunch if they wish. And we serve produce within a 15-mile radius, so that includes the Fen Farm Dairy Baron Bygod cheese, Hempmill Village bread, Eastgate larder, Medlar jelly, and other things. Obviously, our wine as well. And there's Hannah just serving some lunch after these people have had a tour, just overlooking the vines. So if you did want to have a look at what we're doing, you can head along to flintvineyard.com. Oh, I've got a question. How long's that been there? I hope that's not been there too long. That's embarrassing if that's been there a long time. That's just appeared. How long do vines live? I'll tell you that in a minute. So flintvineyard.com, you can book a tour or you can buy wine, and yeah, come along and visit us. We'd love you to. So I'll answer that in 2 seconds. Oh, it's gone. Don't even forget that. That's me doing a tour, making everyone laugh. And any questions? So how long does a vine live? Well, when we plant vines, we hope that they last for at least 25 years. We hope that they will last maybe 50 years, maybe over 100 years. The vines that were on that earlier slide when I was working in Beaujolais were over 100 years old. It's less tried and tested in England, but we certainly hope that vines will last at least 50 years. So when they're planted in the ground, we have to protect them in their early years. So we don't actually crop fruit in the first year. We only actually try and aim to achieve a fruit crop from a new vine after about the third or fourth year. So provided a vine is looked after, it will come back and grow successfully for, hopefully at least 50 years, maybe up to 100 years. So that, I think, is probably going to mean done, unless anyone's got any further questions. Oh, hello. Do you have any concerns about climate warming? Global warming? Yeah, yes and no. I mean, ironically, global warming is helping English wine industry a little bit, because we are a very marginal, very cool climate. We're probably the coolest climate that's trying to grow grapes for wine. And so any kind of heat that we can get into the vineyard, which is why we use trellis systems to encourage photosynthesis, any kind of heat or sunlight that we can get is a good thing. But along with all of the global warming, we're getting other things happening as well. So although things are warming up, we're still getting lots of late spring frosts. And it can be a terrible situation when you have a late spring. Well, when things are warming up, the vines think, oh, it's all nice and warm in April, so they start to produce buds because of global warming. But then you get your late spring frost at the end of April, and because your vines are so more advanced because of the hot weather, they can get much more hit by frost. So generally, global warming is a positive thing for English vineyards. It's not a positive thing for the warmer regions, like places like the south of France or California, because the vines are just ripening too quick, and they're not able to. They don't have the time on the vine to develop all the flavors that we can get in England, because they're just ripening the sugars too quickly, and the grapes have to be picked before they've had a chance to develop any complex flavors. So generally in England, it's considered to be a good thing, with the exception of some of the weird things that happen like frost. But the rest of the world, people are getting concerned, particularly warmer regions, and also places like Champagne, where they rely on making very sort of crisp acidic wines, which need a cool climate in order to do that. So yeah, I mean, I think I am done now because I can't see any more questions coming through on the chat. So I imagine that Ryan will probably take back the reins, or Graham will take back the reins, and that'll be me done. So I can yeah, stop sharing my screen, I believe.
Hello again. Well, thanks very much, Ben, for that. Not only displaying your knowledge and expertise in all aspects of wine growing, but showing a tremendous excitement and passion for what you're doing, which was a joy to watch and listen to. Um, I certainly have always enjoyed drinking wine, but now I know a lot more about it. So thank you so much for doing that for us. And just a reminder to you who have been watching this afternoon, please do send your emails through showing your appreciation for Ben's talk, and then we'll pass them on to him. And if indeed there's any further questions you have, please ask us those as well, and we'll again pass them on and get an answer and feed that back to people. So once again, thank you, Ben, for your time in a busy part of your working life, and for all you watching. And as I said earlier, our next evening performance is on the 30th of July. So we look forward to seeing you again then. Okay, once more, thank you very much. Keep safe. Goodbye.